Hello everyone, welcome. Welcome to the Resident Association's Covenant Associations workshop on updating cluster standards. My name is Vern James, I'm one of the Covenant's advisors. Just a couple of items of business. We have snacks in the back over there. Restrooms are out on the lobby if you haven't been here before. Women's restrooms on the other side of the elevators. And we have all your cluster books here tonight if you're interested in plowing through those and grabbing your advisor and asking some questions. The format for our meeting tonight is as follows. First, Trevor and Lucy will take us through an introduction to cluster standards. Then we have one cluster board president, Jay Monroe from Hampton Meadows cluster, who will offer some comments about recent experience updating their cluster standards. Next, our director, Anna Barone, will talk about improvements we're making on the Resident Association side of things. After that, we'll set up a panel over here. We'll do a question and answer period for just kind of general questions that everyone wants to talk about. And then we can kind of mix a little bit if you have specific questions for your advisor. We really encourage you tonight to interact with our staff. Ask questions at any time, interrupt us or whatever, and let's get this information going and a good dialogue going with all the cluster board officers that are here tonight. So with that, turn it over to Trevor and Lucy.
Great, thank you, Vern. So we're just going to jump right into it and discuss cluster standards. So Trevor, can you explain what are cluster standards?
Sure. Cluster standards are design specifications unique to each cluster for certain exterior elements. For example, roofs, colors, windows, lights often allow applicants to proceed with installation without an application for staff approval.
So what does this mean?
That means they might not have to come to a night meeting if they meet certain criteria. So Lucy, where did cluster standards originate?
Sure. So cluster standards were originally determined by the builder and approved by the design review board. Cluster boards have the ability to change or add to these cluster standards and submit an application for review to the design review board. These changes allow for more variety of options, and because some items and materials may be discontinued or no longer available. So why should clusters have cluster standards?
Cluster standards help to maintain harmony of community design, enhance overall property values, encourage environmental responsibility, and provides flexibility in choices. Why should we update them, Lucy?
Absolutely, because some products and materials may no longer be available. It also provides more option, and it makes use of new energy efficient and sustainable products that may be appropriate for the cluster. In addition, it makes it easier for members to make changes to their properties and repairs to their properties without the potential need of an application. And if anything, what are some good tips that we can provide to cluster boards for updating standards?
First and foremost, don't bite off more than you can chew. Limit the number of updates that you do at any one time. Obtain brochures, samples, and other supporting documents needed for the review. Select styles and colors that are appropriate for the architecture of the cluster.
So that means colonial products with colonial properties?
Absolutely, or contemporary with contemporary. Also, schedule an annual cluster board review of standards and product availability. And always remember that the advisors are here to help you.
Thank you, Lucy and Trevor. Next, we have a cluster board officer who recently did an update, Jay Monroe, president of Hampton Meadows.
So our cluster is 50 single-family homes just south of Wheeling in Sunrise Valley. We've actually probably started when I took over 5 years ago. They had been doing this for 10 years or so. The cluster's been around for 35 years, so we haven't always done a great job. But 10 years or so ago, we started reviewing the cluster standards every year. It's really a lot of just talking with our members about what things they think they want to do. We do an annual survey every summer and kind of get a good feeling for what people want to do to their homes in the next year. And we use that to update. I think a few years ago we did colors, Recently we did doors and windows, but it's sort of a hidden benefit for your members because when they go to try to update their windows or doors, you will have already provided them with a bunch of models available at Home Depot or other places. And it's sort of unseen, they don't realize all the work we're doing in the background. But I do know that based on the survey, one of the number one comments we get back from the members is how beneficial it is when they want to add a light to the outside of their home. It's already in the standard, so they don't have to go through a long process. I will say though that probably half of what we do as a cluster standard update, we get from someone who went through the process and had to sit through 1 or 2 PRB meetings, and so we take that and we apply their idea to the standard and then add a bunch of other options. And I think recently one of our homeowners installed one of those new paver driveways, and then we created a standard for it. Now there's like 7 throughout the neighborhood. So I really just can't tell you enough like how beneficial it is to your members not to have to go through the process, like to just know that what they want to do to their homes is already sitting there in a book. Well, yeah.
That's fantastic, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to hear from our director, Anna Barone. She's going to talk about some of the changes that we're making at the RA, changes in the process and some of the, we've got it right there. Oh, you're skipping ahead there. Yeah, exactly.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for sharing your evening with us. It's always nice to get a good group of people out for this workshop since updating cluster standards is so important. So we like to see cluster board members engaged in this process. We wanted to tell you a little bit about what staff has been working on. This is a project that we've been wanting to kick off for quite some time, but it's taken some planning and some resources to get it kicked off. So we have, as you see, we have all these books on the credenza back here, which represent cluster standards. So it's basically your 20th century method of collecting the data for the cluster standards. And of course, we wanted to move towards the 21st century. And in terms of these binders, basically, this is what the staff is using to refer to your cluster standards. And if somebody else wanted to access the cluster standards, we can either put it on a flash drive and email it to someone, or someone can pick that up. But it's really basically just the binder that we have available. So we wanted to progress and have this information made into a digital format so that everybody can have access to it. So we have produced a software program and progressed into a digital format of the cluster standards. And of course, it's going to take some time because we have 134 clusters. But what you'll see, if you go into, you may want to go back so that they know exactly where to go. So if you go into Property Owners Resources, and then you go to Reston Neighborhoods, when you scroll down, it'll say down here, to find your digital cluster design standards, please click here. So when you click there, you're going to see a nice little bookshelf. So these are sort of like the binders that you see there, but they're in digital format. And when you open, Vanessa's going to go to one of the books, and you open the book, it's going to be like the digital format of a cluster standard book. And it allows you to flip through and see the cluster standards. And of course it'll say, that this is not for color matching, but it'll tell you the color names. There are places where if there's materials or lights or what have you, it'll actually take you to a link that you can click on, and it'll take you specifically to that shopping cart to show you exactly where you can get that light or paint or what have you. But the entire book is digital, and it's accessible through the website, so anybody in your cluster can access it. Obviously, staff can access it, but it's really accessible to anybody. So, moral of the story is that we're trying to do the books based on, the most up-to-date cluster standards. So what you really want to do, I'm hoping that the clusters will find this to be a beneficial tool. But we obviously want to make sure that whatever we work on and whatever is uploaded to the website is an active cluster standard. So we are working through, of course, like I said, we're going to work as fast as we can, but this is sort of a extracurricular activity of sorts. So we're doing that as we're doing our regular workflow. But we want to make sure, and we know that once it's uploaded to the website, as we move forward, there's going to be updates, and we'll update it if there's any changes. But the initial one that is uploaded, we want to make sure that the board has done a good job of making sure that their standards are up to date. So if you know that your cluster needs to have their cluster standards updated, you want to make sure to work with your advisor to go through those updates so that we can work on your book and make sure that everything is up to date before it gets uploaded to your bookshelf. Any questions about this process?
Is there a time schedule for having these uploaded?
Well, our goal is to get them, we have half of them finished by the end of 2017, and the entire, group of clusters, 134, finished by 2018. But we hope to have at least half of the clusters, in other words, 65, by the end of 2017. That would be our goal. We have how many
names of those
so far?
clusters, or
Sorry?
do you have a list of names of those clusters you'll be doing this year?
Well, again, because we want to work on the ones that have the most up-to-date standards, it's kind of hard to identify because, if say there's somebody in this room that says, oh, I really want mine done, and they contact our advisor and says, I really want to get my cluster book digitized, we would prioritize that one because we want to get it up-to-date and digitized. So that's kind of the priority, to just get them up-to-date and digitized. So it could be that we might think, oh, we'll do, Baldwin Grove or something like that. But then if that's not up to date, we would prioritize one that does get updated. So it's a little bit hard to tell, which ones we would do. But we have so many. Right now we have how many? 17 on the bookshelf. So you'll see progress as the weeks go by. But we obviously want to do all of them.
So if we went to the website, we could see at least 17 of those books now.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, as they get done, they get uploaded on the bookshelf. Yes,
So those that we see up there right now, are you saying those have been done?
those are done. Yeah, this is live. This is up there now and accessible. Yes,
So the book can be downloaded and saved?
yes, yes. And again, anybody can access it, so anybody, if you say saw, if your cluster was Birchfield Woods, for example, and you wanted to go back to your members and say your cluster book has been digitized and you can access it, anybody in your cluster can access it, and you wanted to let them know, you're welcome obviously to do that. But obviously we want to move as fast as we can. But like I said, it's really important that what we have, on the website is up-to-date standards. Yes.
These remind me of a catechism that I used to have to memorize when I was a child. And I think as you get older, you start realizing some of the things that you memorized are not, should be there. If times have changed, how do you change? This is that seems to me becomes more rigid when we have the rest. And I moved here in the 80s, and it's changed. Just go out here and look at along the roads, and yet we're still in a 80s or, well, 50 years ago, right? We're still fixed in that mode, and there's some of the products we use don't last. They've been improved. There's sort of a constant turnover, new roofs, new sidings, and I don't think this is going to help that process of making changes.
No, it doesn't.
It's using products that are 20 years old.
Right, now I think this is really just to access the information and, what you have in your standards currently.
What I'm interested in is a process, though, how you change it. I've been to DRB meetings, I've been on our cluster board, I've been in the Resident Association, volunteer for years, and I think that these things need to be changed a little bit.
Well, the advisors can help you with updating your cluster standards, but I think that part of what I think I'm hearing you say is that there are materials in a lot of the clusters that also need to be updated in terms of what is being used in the clusters.
We have cedar roofs, and I know some people, insurance companies are charging them extra because they have cedar roofs.
Right.
Now, should that be in those books? No. How do you change that?
Well, and that's the process that, we're talking through in this workshop, because you would have to, your cluster board would have to identify what material you would want to switch to, and then you would have to bring that, you would have to do an application to bring to the design review board to get approved.
Well, I think what you end up saying is the help with it, you just go with that from the standard. It does make it, it's not a process for change or improving the system. That's just my position.
Isn't it true that any changes that are approved will turn up in these books?
Yes, yes. But the cluster has to go through the process of changing the material first.
I'll give you a good example. Last meeting I went to, there was a woman in there who had some remodeling done on her home. And the contractor suggested she put a little 2-inch strip around the windows. And she came to the DRB to request approval of that because it wasn't quite accepted. Plus, the board said, no, you can't do that. You got to keep it to the old standards. Maybe that little strip keeps the rain out of their house or keeps the sash from wearing, weathering too soon. I don't know.
Well, if the cluster has a standard, and I know the advisors are really the experts on this, but if the cluster has a standard, the homeowners, need to comply with that standard, and if it's something that, goes outside of their standard, then they would need to go back to their cluster board and ask that the standard either be changed or that it would be updated.
But with all this construction going on in Resident, do you think you should go back to 1980 standards that were set 30 years ago?
If I may. Yeah.
Thank you.
For a moment, folks.
Okay, that's
There's a question that's been asked, how to change the standard is what I think that you're asking. Hear myself echo a little bit, so I'm sorry, I don't really need a mic. I'm kind of a loud guy anyway. They will attest to that. So it seems like you want to know how to change the standard. And that's part of what this tonight's about.
Okay, good.
So it's a pretty easy process. You do a little research as to what you want to change and come to the design review board as the cluster board, and they'll review the proposed change. I think that's getting closer to what you're looking for. Do you have anything, Tricia?
So if I could interject just a little bit too, I think what you need to focus on is not so much the manufacturer, the style, but the overall appearance. And be a little more flexible with, say, you're looking at window replacements, maybe you give a range of your trim requirements. And you don't say it has to be this or this. Then you limit, because when you do that, you limit yourself. Like you say, they get discontinued, then you're stuck, and then you're back to square one. So ranges equivalent to, you can get examples of manufacturers or products that you like to use, but leave it simple and leave it open.
So, and another just suggestion is that, sort of like you were saying something about the cedar shakes on the and the issues with those. But there are actually a bunch of synthetic materials out there that mimic the look of cedar shake, and you would never even know it wasn't real wood. And we actually have some samples in our library, so it would probably be a great idea for you to come in with and meet with your advisor and just peruse the materials that we have that have been approved for use elsewhere in Reston, that are those updated materials that would be beneficial to your cluster. We would be more than happy to make an appointment.
I tried that, it didn't work.
Didn't work.
But I think to your point is, you don't have to stick with things that, go back to 1980. You can improve and move forward with the times, but you just have to work towards, identifying materials that are equivalent and better, sustainable, and energy efficient probably. But and the advisors can assist you with identifying other items and other materials that have been approved throughout Reston and that are probably have a better chance of being approved through the design review board.
Would they recommend that to the cluster boards?
I'm sorry?
The cluster boards pretty much just do the deciding, and I've been on the board.
Right.
Can you think you can convince the cluster boards to adopt these recommendations? I agree with what you're saying.
We do have some cluster standards that read like that. I think where we get caught up is when they try to get too specific, and that's where the discontinuity problem comes in. So, vinyl as a siding product, if that's all you have, if a profile is important to you, meaning the profile, the exposure on the vinyl siding is important to you, that profile remains the same, but the product can change. So there's lots of different ways of putting that together without calling out a specific manufacturer. And I think that's where most of the standards have a problem.
We have a couple of
I'm
questions.
done.
Thank you. I'm hearing two things.
Wait, I'm sorry, I apologize. The young lady behind you has been waiting for some time.
Me?
Yes.
Okay. No, I'm hearing
No, thank you.
Go ahead, she will have another.
I'm hearing two things. Be specific, don't be specific. Here's a link to a model that you can buy, but don't link to a model because it's too specific. So I'm working on revising our cluster standards because they are very, very out of date. And I don't even know how to begin writing this when I'm told in one sentence be specific, and then in the next, provide the model from Home Depot, and then I'm being told, don't do that, because then you're going to be outdated, which I totally agree with that second half of the statement. The first half makes me nervous. So I don't know. I don't want to put a lot of work into this and come up to the design review board and then be told,
Right. It's styled. We have cluster standards right now that have specific models. So we're putting these books together based on what the current standard is. If it's listed as a model, then that's the information that's going to be provided. If you come to the design review board with similar carriage style lights and a similar style color, then that would be something they would consider. They're looking at style, not necessarily specific models. And there are some clusters that are very, for lack of a better term, cookie cutter. Everything's pretty much the same. And then there's others that have a much more of a variety, and that's okay. But they just want to make sure that the neighborhood stays consistent.
I guess I'll walk forward so you can hear me. I'm very encouraged to hear you talk about, that we can be specific, or we can be, other clusters can be a little bit more, allow some more flexibility. And you mentioned instead of having cedar shakes, you've got examples of roofing material that looks like cedar. But when people from our cluster have asked the board, they haven't done an official application, but they've asked our advisor, and they say, well, it's fine, you can change, but all the houses in a row have to change at the same time, and that's almost impossible. If somebody just put on a new roof 3 years ago, and then, your other neighbor put one on 7 years ago, and then you want to put one on, but you don't want cedar shakes, it just doesn't work. So is there any flexibility in that?
Well, the cedar shake issue is different than if you're in a community with asphalt and you want to go to an architectural look. And again, I think the continuous roof line is something you have to consider. And each cluster is unique. Are they very Are they continuous? And what would that look like as you change those products to a new product? Again, the products that are in most of these books are, like you said, 25, 30 years old. We've got a lot of nice stuff out there that can be added, and we often will add that information into an approval for an individual in a cluster, that the cluster, look at this as something that could update to their standard for their entire community. So all of us can help you look at your individual cluster and make some recommendations on which direction you can go to maybe update to some of the higher end products.
I don't think you answered what I said, is that the problem is the timing.
Right.
We were told we can't do it unless all the houses or condos or
Right.
townhomes in a row, and that's almost impossible.
Right, and that's a unique scenario with the Cedar Shake. So that's something that, I can't say the design review board, you'd have to talk to them and see what you could do, but we have seen them do those buildings one at a time.
Oh, so it is possible.
It's possible. It's possible. We just had, anything's possible. I mean, we just had a cluster go from cedar siding to a hardy plank without it, having to replace the whole row. And that's a change. It's a big change. And they had to work out some dynamics with that because of the shared walls, but it's possible.
So we're going to have another time frame for questions and answers, but Joy Onizuka made it to our workshop, and she was going to make some comments about her experience with updating cluster standards. So we'll let her make her comments, and then we'll go back to our question and answer session.
Hi, thank you for...
Can you come up to the mic?
Yeah.
Anyway, I am very interested in cluster standard updates because as someone who came to Reston almost 10 years ago, I was on the phone in Arlington with a covenants advisor about a violation on the property that we were interested in buying. And I was going through the various community guidelines and asking questions, well, if there's no bike storage, where am I supposed to put my bikes? And going through the limitations of what I saw about buying into Reston, and also concerns I had about standards which weren't applicable or violations which would be, I would assume, as a property owner. And so when we moved in, one of the things I did quickly was I got on board, and what I discovered was change is hard. And it's not because it's RA necessarily, it's first you got to figure out what are the standards, and it takes a lot of time to work through it. Then you've got to talk to a board that's not necessarily in consensus with what you want to do. So one of my first objectives was, let's get new door standards. And what I was greeted with was no. And earlier this week, I actually installed the door I wanted 10 years ago. My way of saying it's a process. It's also going to be hit or miss. My experience with RA over the course of 10 years, and I've worked with 3 different covenants advisors, is if I make the time and I come in and I have a question, they can give me the information I need to start to work with. But I can't ask them to do the work for me. And so part of the struggle when I'm listening to someone back there say you don't want to be shot down, I would say expect to be shot down. So you want to come with, I would say in a year, if you had 2 updates that you thought were critical, try them and plan. Go in there with an application that is as solid as you can make it, because it's a sales pitch. RA can get you to DRB. DRB does not work for RA, and that also was a big surprise. I thought I had great support, but we got shot down. It doesn't work that way. So you've got to come in with a rationale. So for example, I did a siding replacement. Cedar is super expensive. It's a lot more efficient to do hardy plank. We had to get the cluster update. We brought a couple different manufacturers. We bought the samples. So you got to expect a truckload of stuff. And the more that you've got, the better. Because what we discovered is you may not get it all approved, but you may get some of it approved. That's a victory. And we had that experience. So this year we have updated our outdoor lights. And the reason we did is because none of our approved standards were even on the market anymore. So we asked all our neighbors, send pictures of what you got. We prepared the application. We ran with 18 different lights, and we got a good percentage of them approved because they were similar enough in size. The sizing was right, the lighting was right, so you can't go crazy, but you can advocate for environmentally friendly, for things which are on the market, because nobody wants you stuck back in the 80s. The other thing I found is, as a board member, you have to keep reiterating why it's important, because it is a slow process and not everybody is going to agree with updates. And I think one of the best strategies that I found was when properties go to sale or went to sale recently, find out what were the violations. And if you can identify violations and you've got 3 or 4 different properties which have the same issue going on, that becomes a cluster standard update, and there's going to be agreement to get behind it. And it's you serving the community, not necessarily getting something done in a particular home. So that's my take on this process. And expect, again, you're not going to get everything, but you're going to get something. And I think every time you get that wind, it's reassuring. The community sees that the board is working for them, and the community looks better.
All right, yeah, so we're just going to kick it off. Yes, ma'am.
So what does an application look like? Is there a form we fill out? What is it what are we supposed to present to the board?
Sure, I'll start that process.
Thank you very much.
The first thing that we want you to do is talk to your cluster your cluster advisor, and they're going to help you through the whole process from day one and on. There's a special application. Oh, I thought you were talking about that. There's a special application for changing common elements, and it has to be signed by either president or vice president on the front and 2 other cluster board officers on page 2. And you have to show that you've done notification out into your community. That can be an open meeting minutes. It can be an email, a newsletter, some way that you can show that you've made good notification out to the members. Are you going to pull it up? And it might go into, just go into the changing the updated cluster standards, right? Okay, so anyway, you can send that electronically, but usually with cluster standards, there's samples involved in this kind of thing, and we're happy to meet with you and sit down and look at what you're going to. A lot of times we're already familiar with the product, Hardy Plank, or CertainTeed roofing, certain colors and this kind of thing. It may be as simple as a color change to roofing. You're adding a color, something like that. A lot of what we do in cluster standard work is adding colors, adding a style. Generally, clusters won't say, okay, no more T111, and you have to change it by 2025 or whatever like that. Usually they'll leave the old standard, and then they'll just add on the next standard, and that kind of thing. But of course, eventually, you've got to get it back into a kind of consistent look, a consistent architectural look in your community. Anything to add, folks? Okay, and then beyond that is the actual review process. All cluster standard reviews are done at panel level, which is the first level that you'll hit for this kind of review. And it's 3 members of the DRB. And almost all the decisions are made right there at that group. You can appeal their decision to the full board. But usually it has to be, you have to show some misapplied guideline or some, what's the other? Or new information that wasn't present for the panel to use to make their decision. But generally speaking, what I've seen in all those panel meetings, and I've been to several, is that they're very reasonable. They're going to ask a lot of questions. You've got lay people and professionals on that panel, so they're going to be reviewing it carefully. Expect to answer a lot of questions, of course, but a lot of those they go pretty smoothly, especially if you're simply adding elements, new materials, that kind of thing, especially if the board is already familiar with those new materials.
Can you show us the
actual
breadcrumb chain to that, please?
Awesome. So this one you'll see, very good. So this one, as you'll see, it looks similar to the regular individual application, but it says for exterior changes on common property and cluster and condo standards. This is not a touchscreen, is it? So anyway, and then it's just some basic information. The request for approval, of course, is where you're going to line it out. And Trevor's suggestion is absolute. You really should not bite off too much. And if you're going to do windows, that's a lot of work. Doors, standards, things like that can take a lot of work. There's a lot of new material out there for doors, a lot of styles that people want for doors. And then just down there is the president or vice president's signature, 2 other cluster board officers, notification. They go into the short form here like this, but the DRB really wants to see that you've done a cluster-wide notification for something like standards. Yes.
I think one thing people need to remember is, like, our cluster is contemporary. We got people that want to put on colonial doors, and the DRB is never going to approve that. So I think you've got to know the style and keep that in mind when you're doing things, because that's the problem we have. People want this and that and the other, and it's never going to be approved because it doesn't go with the style of the neighborhood.
Quite true. And then aesthetics is really what they're looking at. That's the main thing they're looking at in their decision process.
What if you set a cluster standard, let's say for doors, and then 2 years or 5 years down the road, you decided that you don't want the 5 options, you only want to cut it down to 3 options. What happens then? Can a cluster board do that?
Absolutely. Yeah, cluster boards can add to standards, they can remove from standards. So let's say you possibly got an approval for a deck color of purple. Not saying that would happen, but 3 years later you decided, no, we don't want that color anymore, it doesn't go with it. You do have the ability to apply to remove that color from the standard. So you can add to and remove.
What about the folks that have that particular color?
Sure.
Do you have to wait a certain period of time, or?
If they install something that was in accordance with that current standard at that time, then it is deemed to be approved. But if they decide that they want to use a different deck color a couple years later and that color has been removed from the standard, they have to use one of the new approved colors. So it would be indefinite until they needed to change to that color.
How do they sell the house, though?
If they sell, then they can keep the color. Again, it's deemed to be approved, but
So it's grandfathered in until...
We don't use the word grandfather, it's either approved or disapproved. Exactly, yes.
And I would say that not only goes for deck color or colors, it goes for any materials, the roofing. I have a cluster that recently changed their roofing standard, and they understand that not everybody can do the roofs all at one time. So they say the next time you have to replace your roof, you have to come into compliance, or by, I think it was 2025. So they gave them a range. They looked at all the overall health of the roofs and gave them a range.
So you can't put a date, though, a limit on it?
Certainly could.
Yeah.
And I have another cluster of 4 colors that has to, Southgate, Southgate Square actually has to come into compliance with the new color palette by March of next year. So, and what I do is when somebody comes in, they say, well, my house is this color and I want to repaint my house this color. Technically they can, because the old palette is still in effect, but I advise them it would be better for them to come to this and it would be lesser expense for them.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, well, we're going to open it up to, whatever questions, but I have a question for you. So as you know, in the cluster, when a homeowner does an application, they have to get a signature from a cluster board officer. What's your process for checking that out, for looking over that application? Any cluster?
I can tell you, our cluster actually, due to an incident that occurred 5 or 6 years ago, we now have a very strict policy around it because a cluster board member signed it and then didn't tell anyone, and so that went poorly. But so yeah, what we do is any board member can sign the document, but they have to advise the rest of the board with a scanned copy of the entire document within 24 hours, and then like the board has to decide whether or not to, I can never remember what the little box is called, but
Affected party.
yeah, affected party. the board decides over email whether or not we want to do that. And if we do, then they check the box and it gets submitted. But we make sure that every board member knows they don't have to sign if they don't want to. But if they want to sign a document, then they must sign any document that comes before them. And we actually made the rule that we will sign no matter what, because we want to reserve the right to be involved through checking the box, but we don't want any one board member to be able to, decide for the community what should happen.
And the most important thing to remember is that's notification, it's not permission. So, if I'm a homeowner and no one on my board will sign my application, I can just send the application with a certified letter and let the advisor know, look, I notified the board that I'm going to do this. The board, your cluster board, still has the right to register as affected party. But just remember that signature is just a notification. I'm planning the purple deck, and I'm notifying you that I'm doing that.
Right.
So just, yeah.
And boards have no right to just refuse to sign an application. If you try to refuse to sign an application, they can send you a certified letter and say, here's my receipt, I notified. And so it's much better to, as a board, have a process in place where you do have a review process where you're looking at applications that are brought to you. And remember, it has to be an officer of the board that signs it, not just a member at large. But it's very important to have a process in place so that you are catching things that you want to be affected parties to. Because what happens often is a board member gets an application and they just sign it, not thinking, well, I'm the guy that's supposed to sign it, I signed it, here you go. The DRB will catch it if it's against our standards. But then the DRB says, well, the board signed it, and they're asking for, something slightly off from the standard, and they approve it, and then the board comes back and says, why did you approve it? It's because we're also relying on you all to make sure that if you really don't want something in your community, you let us know that that's a problem. We're trying to be a lot more flexible and allow some upgrades in the community. There's a lot, we don't want to stick people in the 80s. We want to allow those upgrades. So if we get an application and you're not signed off as an affected party for hardy plank and you really are hardcore about sticking to that cedar siding, we're probably going to allow the hardy plank because you didn't sign off as an affected party. So you do have to think about that aspect of it as well.
I have a question. So you all are updating individual properties if the standard's not in the cluster book, you are submitting those applications, and they are getting approved.
So someone can submit an application for whatever they want. If you want hardy plank, even just because it's not your standard, doesn't mean you can't apply for it. You can apply for whatever you want, but your cluster board has to sign off on your application, and you have to submit it through the DRB. I mean, for upgraded materials, unless the DRB knows the cluster board is dead set against it, they're going to try to allow those newer upgraded materials where they can because it's overall better for everybody in the community, right? And once you have 2 or 3 homeowners that have that in the community, it's a precedence is set. So if you don't want hardy plank, but 2 or 3 applications have been allowed to have it, you're going to have it in your entire community.
And this is actually one of the primary reasons why, as a board, we took this on. We were trying to eliminate inconsistencies between homes because it was creating a perception of something not being fair. So some households got something and some didn't. So we just said it's better if we're in control of the cluster update so we know what it is and the parameters so you don't get into individual arguments or some people are approved or not. So I haven't thought about that context in a while.
Well, and that's a good point too, because if you are a cluster board who is updating your standards on a regular basis and the DRB sees this application for something slightly off, but they see that you have very consistently updated your standards, they're going to think twice about, oh, well, is this something in line with that? If you haven't updated your standards in 20 years, and we're looking at a book that's so old, we don't even know if you've ever looked at it, they're more than likely going to approve that material because nobody's updating it, you're not writing your homeowner's options, so we're going to do that.
If a resident submits an application and bypasses the cluster board, and you realize that, will you go back to the cluster board?
We don't accept the application, we reject it and tell them they have to go to the cluster board.
And an important note that Tricia made is we look for the cluster board officer signature. So president, vice president, secretary, or treasurer can't even be a lay member of the board. It has to be an officer that signs it.
we ask for copies when they ask us to sign. If they don't bring me a copy, they have to sit downstairs and wait while I go upstairs and copy it.
Nice. Very good.
Yeah, anyone reviewing can have a copy of it, yes.
And we also, when we send out our decisions, when we send out our decisions, we CC, or in the email, a lot of this is going digital now. We send the clusters copies of the decisions as well. So we're trying to keep you guys informed of what's going on in the cluster. So if you see something that's been approved and it's not exactly the standard, ask us why. And ask us what how they made the decision. You can always go to our design review board managers and ask them, because the advisors we tend not to go to all the design review board meetings. The managers do. So.
Just an observation, one of the meetings as far that Chadwick, your legal counsel had, one of the compliance things that they suggested is when individuals do an application, as far as with the design review board, that the board really has a responsibility to keep those applications for a certain number of years. So you really do need to take copies or digitize them or something like that. You just can't sign them. A board member should not just sign them and then forget about it.
When the design review board rejects an application, is there a record of their decision on why they said no? One of the issues I'm working on is front doors, and I was told that the board had gone to the DRB about the doors and were rejected, so I would really like to know why, so I can adjust to whatever. So how do I?
Yeah, your advisor would be able to pull that decision.
Okay.
And right there in the decision will say, either deferred or, disapproved because.
Okay.
And it will always say some reason. Some of them, if they're kind of older, they might be a little vague, so we'll have to look into it, see if we can find any notes or anything for you. But generally speaking, these days, it's done very consistently.
Thank you.
I have a very general question. Can maybe a group of homeowners, or can you do something about walkways in general? I know that I have, I think, a 24-inch wide walkway, and my neighbor wants to do a 4-foot wide walkway, 2 doors down, but her area is completely different. I have no grass on either side of my walkway. I have a garage, there and some shrubbery, and then I have about 8 inches on the other side. That's a low retaining wall. So I'm sort of stuck. But the other neighbor has a standard walkway, which may be, I don't know, 2.5 or 3 feet or something. And the grass has started to sink, considerably. So she's actually had her grandchildren fall because they were running on the walkway and they went off the edge. And I have a neighbor who uses a walker, and she has a terrible problem. So my question is, in general, can a group get together and say, we want 4-foot walkways? And can that be made a standard? So individually, you don't have to.
So the way how that works is, as I was saying, that you can submit individual applications. But in order to make a cluster standard, it has to come from the cluster board. Now, if those particular groups like yourself and your neighbors are having a problem with the walkway, what I always suggest to my clusters is maybe you want to go to the board and make them be aware that this is the issue that's going on with this group of neighbors, and it may be a potential issue for other individuals in the cluster, and get the board's wheels spinning on, okay, maybe we need to think about updating this particular standard. So you can do that, and I always encourage the homeowners to communicate with your board as much as you can if you're having issues on different elements of the home, since they are the ones that can update the standard. But you can always, instead of, you can always do an individual application for an immediate, if you want to go to the design report for an immediate answer, review or what have you. But for a standard on, a set group that's having an issue, talk with your cluster board and get them to.
Our cluster board refused to take a stand and told the homeowner to do it individually, and it's not the first time. Whether it's a deck issue, go do it yourself.
Well, well then, yeah, they can definitely submit an individual application. I mean, it would, each individual homeowner would have to submit, but, you know, you can always submit an individual application for anything.
And so just to add to that, one of the things that I've been advising some of the homeowners and one of my clusters whose board doesn't have the time to really keep up with everything, because it's a time-consuming volunteer effort, and we don't always have the time to look at everything, right? And so if you're a homeowner of a cluster and you are hearing from a bunch of your neighbors, we all want this thing to be our standard, and you're not getting the reaction out of your board, do the legwork for them, fill out the application for them, so that all they have to do, sign their names, review it at a meeting, get all the required signatures and submit it, and they're not stuck out there trying to do all the research, figure out what it is that everybody wants. And I've had some success with that, with homeowners individually bringing to the board, hey, you know, here's a petition, 15 of us have signed it, this is what we want, here's the materials, here's the application, we've done it for you, basically. So there is some success with also taking that approach, because sometimes we are too busy to, as board members, to focus on that.
Yeah, let me extend on that, just from like a procedural standpoint. The first thing when we get an application from a townhouse, first thing we look at it, is there a cluster standard? If the cluster standard is, 30-inch walkways, well then there might be a problem if the person wants to, 4-foot walkway or whatever. So we have to look there first. If not, then we go back to the RA guideline. Is there an RA guideline for width of privately owned sidewalk? No, there isn't, But that's what we'll be looking at first. Is there a cluster standard? Then is there an RA guideline? And then if we're just looking at it, it's an individual wants it, it's their property. We don't see that the cluster is signed affected. So we're going to, put that one, get all the information and put it up for review.
Since you did mention RA guidelines, could you show where it is?
Well, I think that all of us have found that it's a lot easier to send you a link. But anyway.
Well, I'm
All right,
just thinking you will show us where the link is.
We're going to try.
This is coming up the mobile version.
Yeah, so
this is
We're not used to this.
Yes, the mobile version.
Didn't y'all just change this week or something, the last week or two?
There are
Something
always
is different
updates.
last week.
It's an ongoing thing.
Well, all I know is this is Reston.org, right? And this is Property Owner Resources, right? This is, thank you. This is Design Review. All right? And here's your design guidelines. We're already, 3 layers down? Well, sorry, that's the way this works. So now you're going to pick it out. Oh, it's a cluster housing, right? It's not single family, it's not cluster common or whatever. And this is what we use all the time. Oops, did I go the wrong one? So this is what we use all the time, and we send links to these, constantly. So I don't know, it's like one.
I put this in our welcome packages.
Walkways.
Walkways and everything. So, thank you. I appreciate it. Okay. So, you just start down, and it's always written, all these sheets are written by what level of review does this take? So, the first, it goes from the lowest level of review to the highest. So anytime you're looking at one of these guidelines, the first thing it's going to address is it possible to do what you're thinking about doing without application? Can I plant a bush without application? Landscape planning, yeah, I can. Landscape edging, no higher than 4 inches. We're not looking at that. Probably the only time we look at that when we're doing an inspection is if it's several different kinds of landscape edging right in a row. So that's a little, against the aesthetic. But anyway, so does that help?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So just go back up a little bit. Anyway, so normally what we would do is send you guys the link. You can find it. But cluster housing, that's where they all are right there. Any other I'm just really interested in how clusters review them, because I always hope when I'm seeing an application and I see a cluster board officer signature that it has been looked at, because we have to assume if there's no affected party, and nothing's checked like that, that we reviewed it, and we still check and see if there's a cluster standard, for that element.
And so your comment about when a board member signs that form, they're merely signing that they've been notified, doesn't mean they approve it. Where is that in writing? Is it on the form itself?
Yes.
It's on the form. Okay, thanks.
And I would point out, so an affected party just means that you submit a statement of your concerns to us. We ask that you get to us as quick as you can, typically within 5 days of us receiving the application. But if you get it to us before the review, if the application was set at a consultation review, it'll bump it up to a panel review. And does everybody know what the levels of review that we have? So we have staff review for some items. We have consultation, and consultation is between a DRB member and a manager, design review board manager. A lot of times now we do them electronically. They're a lower level review. We also have panel reviews, and that's 3 members of the design review board. We have less interaction with that, other than when I say we have less, I mean the managers. But, so you would actually come to the meeting, the applicant would come to the meeting, and it would be just like we are now. But it would be the design review board sitting at the table, and you present the application to them, and you guys would present it to them. They'd ask you questions, and that night you would know the decision that they're going to make on the application. It takes a week for them to ratify that decision, so you still have to wait a little bit. It's not an immediate thing, but it's pretty quick. Anybody else have anything to add to that process?
And then full design, full board.
Yeah, full board, but full board is really for big projects. If you're additions, things like that, or appeals. And like I believe we mentioned earlier, in appeal you have to show a preponderance of new information, or how a guideline was misapplied, and they'll possibly hear your appeal. So.
I didn't understand the consultation.
Sure.
Is the board or the applicant involved in that?
No, I'm sorry, I should have clarified that. No, they're not. The applicant, there's no facility for the applicant in that. So that's why we try to get, as advisors, we may ask you for a lot of information. You may say, well, why does Trevor want all of this information? It's because we want a positive outcome for your application, especially if it's going to consultation, because we have to take all that information that you're giving to us, and make it in a digestible format for the design review board. A lot of times, and that's something that I would almost suggest that you ask after we put the package together. Ask us to shoot you a copy of what we're putting together. You'll see the notations that we do. And because a lot of people ask us, we're in the office there, what we do. And it's the violations, of course, but it's putting together everything that you guys give us so we can try to help you with the process.
So I want to interject because we've got kind of sidetracked, but cluster standards always have to go to a panel review.
Yes.
They cannot be done at consultation. Consultation is more your standard application. I want to replace my roof. The standard in the cluster is Desert Storm, but it went out of print like 12 years ago. Here's a color that matches. Can I have this? Easy peasy applications, go to consultation, and hopefully just get a quick approval and we can turn them around. But we do ask for a ton of information so that we can present the best case scenario to them. But for cluster updates, they're always going to go in front of a panel, in front of three-member panel. Recently, I had a cluster that updated I don't know how many was on that, 12 standards at one time, and they had different sections, and we had just very convoluted, complicated applications. And I actually went with them and helped them present their application because they went the first time and tried to do it themselves, and it got deferred because everybody got confused of what was going on, and the DRBs not understanding what they were trying to present really, and I think it was just the way they weren't really sure what they were doing. So I showed up with them the second time, and we between the board and myself were able to effectively present the application in a positive light and got approvals for everything, actually, didn't we? So that is something, if it's a complicated application, your advisor is willing to, go above and beyond and help you out and come to some of these board meetings and help you present things. We're not gonna be like, sorry, you're on your own.
So, yeah, does the firm, I think he had a question here first. I'm sorry.
Yeah, if you've got an appeal to something that's been rejected, is that at all of these different levels as well, or just every appeal goes to the full board?
You can only appeal a panel decision, because the appeals are only heard by the full board. So, and what it is we will put you on as a request for appeal, and then as we discussed earlier, it's up to you to present the facts that you're bringing, that there was something that was not available during the initial review that you now have available, and they'll listen to your case and decide right then and there if they will rehear your application. So it's not a guaranteed appeal hearing, it's an opportunity based on the facts that you present, whether or not they'll rehear it.
Great, thanks.
Jamie, you had a question on deferrals?
Deferred just means that they can't make a decision, there's not enough information.
Correct, and we'll get the information they need and reassign it.
And they're pretty good with asking for what they need or giving you direction as to why they didn't make the decision.
But that's another reason why we ask you for about 1,000 pieces of supporting documentation, because we don't want your application to get deferred, and we're trying to present as much information as possible.
Another reason that an application might be deferred is if the cluster doesn't attend the meeting. If we set you up for a panel, you're expected to have a representative there, especially with cluster standards. The DRB is not going to change a cluster standard without a representative of the cluster at that meeting. We don't represent
one.
Just one. Officer. I believe now, I don't know, do you?
We've had other individuals present for our cluster standard updates.
Okay.
So let's say you're doing, something like a landscaping plan, and you have a landscape architect who's really more prepared to answer the type of questions that a design review board may have. So you're certainly welcome to bring any other experts in that particular field that can present your case or your application better.
But I would say with that, make sure that you still have a cluster board member there, because you don't want somebody there that's going to represent you and agree to things that you may not agree to. So if you have a landscape architect, make sure he's not the only one there. Or if you have a member of the community that put the package together and is going to present it for you, the board is still going to be responsible for the decisions that are made. So you don't want to give any one individual full power. That's it.
Anything else?
Anybody else have any other questions right now? Yes, Ms. Lynn.
Mine is completely different. Everybody here seems to be focused on architecture, color, all that sort of thing. Why isn't a cluster standard related to how many times a board may meet? Why is everything just focused on architecture and color? I mean, I want to see communication within my cluster. And forget it. They have one meeting a year, and it has been suggested that I run for the board, which I probably will end up doing. But it still doesn't mean that I can get our board to meet more than once a year. I would love to see it meet once a quarter. Why isn't there a committee that says communication needs to be a standard as well?
Right, so the number of meetings and how you manage your cluster as a board is relating your cluster's governing documents. And that board is a separate entity from RA. RA does not oversee that board, nor do we.
But you're missing my point. Why is a cluster, what you're talking about cluster standards, only related to architecture? There should be cluster standards in related to communication within the cluster.
Again, they are.
And why, I understand what you're saying, what the cluster board needs to do.
Right.
But why isn't there some responsibility of Reston, being we bought in here and we want to do things properly and we want to communicate with our neighbors, why doesn't Reston Association have a guideline to say you need to communicate with your residents in your cluster instead of throwing it back to the cluster board all the time, who really doesn't want to do that?
Okay, based on sessions we had here last fall about the laws governing this sort of things, in fact, that's a state statute. Our homeowners association, so it's not RA's business, it's yours.
And we're trying to get around that.
Bring a complaint against your own board.
And we are trying to do that, but.
I wouldn't be comfortable having RA getting involved in the government.
But it doesn't.
And that is correct. We have to be careful between, we have to separate between the cluster and RA, and it really is two separate entities. We have to be careful not to give, that's borderline legal advice, and we have to be careful to stay away from that. So when it comes to communication within there, as it was mentioning here, that there are laws that mandate that, and we are not lawyers to give any type of legal advice as to how to go about communicating within the cluster, because that's a separate company, if you want to look at it that way. It's like we can't go out to Home Depot and tell them how to run their business and how to communicate in there. It's a separate company, separate entity. So that's why you don't see RA getting involved in that or providing guidelines. The DRB is focused on aesthetics and the community. So that's what we touch on, and that's what we cover. And so that's why
I understand the DRB, but as far as
your cluster's probably a corporation.
Correct. What?
Your cluster's probably a corporation. It has to abide by the corporation laws.
Right. Governed by the state of Virginia.
It's governed by the statutes of the POA because most of them are incorporated. God knows we don't know any of that.
Okay, well, that's a perfect segue to the next thing, which is we are going to break out into sessions and we're going to come out and meet you guys and just, you can hit us with these great questions. But our next workshop will be the annual legislative update. Reston's Legal Counsel on Thursday, June 15th, 7 p.m. here in the Conference Center. We hope to see you all and more here, and that is always a very well attended and a very, very informative lecture by our council. Okay? We really appreciate you coming, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes to talk and make a little bit. See you next time.